Random House Audio presents The Real All-Americans, the team that changed a game, a people, a nation, by Sally Jenkins. Read for you by David Pittu. The game, like the country in which it was invented, was a rough, bastardized thing that jumped up out of the mud. What was football but barely legalized fighting? On the raw autumn Saturday of November 9th, 1912, it was no small reflection of the American character. The coach of the Carlisle Indian School, Glenn Scobie Pop Warner, strode up and down the aisles of the locker room, a Turkish trophy cigarette forked between his fingers. Warner, slab-faced and profane, wasn't one for speeches unless cussing counted, but he was about to make an exception. The 22 members of the Carlisle team sat, tensing, on rows of wooden benches. Some of them laced up ankle-high leather cleats, thick-soled as jackboots. They shrugged into bulky scarlet sweaters with flannel stuffed in the shoulders for padding. Flap-eared leather helmets sat on the benches next to them, stiff as picnic baskets. Often Warner was at a loss to inspire the Indians. He didn't claim to always understand their motives the way he did those of other college men, and he had put his boot in their backsides on more than one occasion. Jim Thorpe could be especially galling. The 22-year-old Oklahoman from the Sauk and Fox tribe had a strange introverted disposition and a carelessness that baffled Warner. But on this occasion, Warner knew just how to reach Thorpe and his teammates. There was no question the players regarded this game dead seriously. Carlisle, the nation's flagship institution for Native Americans, was to meet the U.S. Military Academy in a game between two of the top teams in the country. It was an exquisitely apt piece of national theater, a contest between Indians and soldiers. The frontier battles between Indians and the saber-waving U.S. Army long knives were fresh in their minds. He had been reminding them of the subject all week long. "I shouldn't have to prepare you for this game," Warner told them. "Just go to your rooms and read your history books." The distance between battlefield and football field was not great that November afternoon. Just 22 years earlier, on December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army had met Bigfoot's band at Wounded Knee in the last large-scale confrontation between the military and American Indians. Feelings between the Army and tribesmen ran so high that this was only the second time government authorities had allowed the two parties to meet on an athletic field. To both sides, football was more than a game. It was war without death. As audience and participants alike understood it, the gridiron was a training tool to prepare the best-bred young men in the country to wield power. Harvard football coach W. Cameron Forbes, the grandson of Ralph Waldo Emerson, in 1900 called the sport no less than the ultimate expression of Anglo-Saxon superiority. It was a game of clout. It was about, among other things, authority. On the eve of the game, contention filled the air. Just 4 days earlier, an old football man, Woodrow Wilson, had won the presidency in a bitterly disputed three-party election. The defeated bull moose progressive, Teddy Roosevelt, another football man, was walking around with an angry lunatic's bullet in his side. Scott Joplin's jangling rag dueled with the First Blues. In Europe there was skirmishing in the Balkans, and in medicine, the Nobel Prize went to a surgeon for advances in, fittingly, sutures. In New York City, 20,000 suffragists marched down Fifth Avenue that Friday night in a torchlight parade. Yet amid all this roil, Americans were transfixed by football. Holding place with these momentous topics in the headlines was the impending contest on the banks of the Hudson River. "Indians to battle with soldiers," the New York Times announced, as if spectators could miss the point or the fraught nature of the contest. Under a cold, slate-colored sky, 5,000 observers filled the grandstands that ringed Army Field. Among them was the silver-mustached Walter Camp, the sports eminence and arbiter of all Americans, who had come to witness the affair firsthand. Correspondents from the New York Tribune, the New York Times, and New York Herald scribbled down bad Indian metaphors in their notebooks. Braid-shouldered officers and cadets in high-necked tunics stood erect in the bleachers, eager to see Army defend its honor. It was an audience steeped in frontier lore, raised on blood-curdling newspaper accounts of hostiles and Western dime novels like Mustang Merle, the Boy Rancher, and of course Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. The goateed huckster showman William Cody was still performing in the fall of 1912. The rising popularity of football had closely followed the ebbing of the frontier wars. It was as though America, at a loss for what to do with itself once the wilderness was subdued, had hit on football as an answer. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Columbia formed the Intercollegiate Football Association on November 23, 1876, just 4 months after the annihilation of George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn. The phenomenon was at least in part explained by the fear that a generation of Gilded Age young men was becoming soft and over-civilized, with nothing left to conquer, and too much time spent in parlors. One of the campuses most obsessed with football was West Point. Some form of participation in it was almost a requirement for the truly aspiring cadet. The Army locker room contained no fewer than 9 future generals. But the cadets didn't just love the game. They loved the most bullying physical form of it. They were a squad of imposing brawn. Their captain, Leland DeVore, stood at 6'5" and 240 pounds. In their backfield was an iron-legged young halfback named Dwight David Eisenhower, known for punishing opponents. The coach of the 1912 Army squad was Ernest "Pot" Graves, a beef-faced martinet whose notion of strategy was straight-ahead battering. Earlier that autumn, Graves had been sitting in the officers' club one day when someone asked him why the cadets employed such a bruising style of play. Outside, a steamroller happened to be parked in front of the club. "There," Graves said, "is my idea of football." In Carlisle, Army met its philosophic and stylistic opposite. The two teams could not have been more different. The Indian players who sat in the visitors' locker room were significantly smaller in size, but they were renowned for their dazzling sleight of hand and the breathtaking Olympian speed of their star runner, Thorpe. Under Warner's creative tutelage, they had an astounding array of trick plays, reverses, end-arounds, flea flickers, and spirals through the air. The talent for deception was partly out of necessity. With a student body of just 1,000, ranging in age from 12 to 25, Carlisle was perpetually outmanned and undersized. But given a choice between power football and a piece of misdirection, they invariably chose the latter. "Nothing delighted them more than to outsmart the pale-faces," Warner observed. Ironically, it was a soldier who had founded Carlisle. Richard Henry Pratt, a cavalry officer and veteran of the frontier wars, established the school in an old Army barracks in Pennsylvania in 1879 for the purpose of civilizing Indian children. On the exterior, Carlisle looked like any other gracious old boarding institution, a series of clapboard, cream-colored dormitories lined a quadrangle where footpaths converged at a Victorian bandstand. But within the walls, Pratt directed a violent social experiment. As Pratt liked to declaim, "Kill the Indian, save the man." On Carlisle's athletic green, however, an altogether different experiment took place, this one conducted by the pupils. The rankings and the record books couldn't convey just how experimental and influential the Indians were on the football field. Every time a quarterback feigns a handoff or rears back to throw, a debt is owed to the Carlisle Indians. Before Carlisle, football was a dull and brutal game, wedges of men pushing around in the mud. The Indians found new ways to win, and in the process transformed the game into the thrilling, high-speed chase it became. They didn't just change football. They changed prevailing ideas about Indians. To well-meaning missionaries, land-grabbing politicians, and Wild West show audiences alike, Indians were alternately heathenish, degraded, mentally inferior, or simply assigned by God to be victims. The Carlisle players were something different. They were winners. But against Army, just win.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?